A lot of Americans today foolishly believe that our government and our legal system were based on the story of the Ten Commandments, on a fictional covenant between God and, Moses and Jehovah, I think would be a better way to describe that. Or they think that our government was based on biblical values, as if there ever was such a thing. It's not only false but absurd under scrutiny, and you don't have to know much history to know that that's wrong, but the more that you know, the more wrong that is. Contrary to what many Americans now believe, the United States was initially founded as the first explicitly secular government. And I know everybody in every other country that I've been to knows that, but I still have a difficult time trying to explain that to Americans. And a good example of this is Marco Rubio, current presidential candidate, who said that our country was founded on the slogan, "In God We Trust," even though that slogan didn't exist until 180 years after our country was founded. And I've actually had people tell me explicitly that they believe that our country was founded by God. Now, our actual human founders included some influential leaders who were neither Christian nor fond of Christians. In fact, some of our founders wrote scathing condemnation of Christianity. But even those of our founders who were Christian knew from firsthand what happens every time religion acquires rule over law. The result has always been an automatic violation of human rights, and this is what theocracy always does until such time as it loses its influence over a hopefully wiser populace who won't tolerate that sort of repression anymore. And the only time that religion is polite is when it has no power. And the more compliant people are, the more power religion has, which is why, for example, the very name of Islam commands submission. So while our pre-Darwinian Declaration of Independence and our national constitution may have vague deistic references to a creator, elsewhere described as nature's God, the name Jesus Christ appears nowhere in either document. And nature's God is a deist reference, but where a Christian may imagine that the later reference to divine providence must refer to Jesus, a Jew or a Muslim might assume that it refers to the Father God instead, and a Hindu, a Sikh, or even a pantheist might have a completely different interpretation of God altogether, including the God of Einstein and Spinoza, which isn't really a deity at all, but just a collection of the laws of nature. So our founding documents were deliberately ambiguous, written the way they were for that reason, in order to accommodate any religion or none. And Americans are very keen on the Second Amendment of the Constitution, where we have a right to bear arms, but we seem to ignore the First Amendment, which is where we have a freedom of religion, where Congress can make no law even respecting the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And one thing that my countrymen fail to understand is that once a government establishes a religion, it invariably also imposes that religion, which of course compromises all others. So it is not possible to have freedom of religion without having freedom from religion, and this is why the First Amendment contradicts the First Commandment, which is another fact that many Americans seem to have overlooked and don't understand even when I've explained it.
And clearly we have moral illusions. I mean, this is from work by Paul Slovic, who's a psychologist, who's asked groups of people, how much would you give to help a little girl named Rokia in need? She's hungry, she needs an education. What would you do to help her? If you ask people this question, you get a maximum donation, or they're going to give as much as they're going to give to anything, and you get a maximum report of empathy. Okay? And so too, if you ask people, how much would you give to help a little boy in need, you get the same result. But if you ask groups, how much would you give to help a little boy and a little girl in need, self-reported compassion and actual material donation drops by 25%. Because this is clearly non-normative. I mean, this is a bug, not a feature. I mean, if you care about the fate of a little girl and you care about the fate of a little boy, you should care at least as much about their combined fate. And as you might expect, the more kids you add, the more you see this trend toward callousness. Just compassion and actual donations go through the floor. Now this, to Slovic's mind, explains what he calls genocide neglect, which is something that many of us have noticed. Genocides are boring. I mean, we actually don't want to pay attention to them. We don't naturally pay attention to them. If they even make the news, we change the channel. And yet, when a little girl falls down a well, I don't know if you recognize the photo on the left, but that's from 1989, baby Jessica fell down a well. Everyone with a television on Earth was just glued to it to find out what was going to happen to this little girl. And yet, 800,000 people can be hacked to death, many of them children, in Rwanda in 2 months, and we really don't have the free attentional resources to notice. This is something we have to, this is something that scientifically we can discover about ourselves, but it's something we have to correct for. We have to clearly engineer our better selves into our laws and our tax codes and our social institutions to protect ourselves from our moment-to-moment failures of moral intuition. But we're simply not disposed to care about the greatest swings in human well-being, it would seem. So, to conclude, I've argued that questions of right and wrong and good and evil relate to questions of human and animal well-being. And clearly, the moment you would concede that, if in fact you do, then these questions fall within our growing scientific understanding of the human mind and everything that can possibly influence it. And therefore, these questions have to have right and wrong answers. And the moment you admit that, you have to admit that certain individuals and subcultures, and even whole cultures, potentially, care about the wrong things. Which is to say, they care about things that will reliably produce needless human misery. And they care about things that will foreclose certain possibilities of human cooperation and happiness. And it seems to me the challenge for us at this moment, really the greatest challenge, is to find a way of talking about human values that allows us to converge as a single species on the kinds of answers we give to the most important questions in human life. To converge on the same economic and environmental and social and political goals. And to do that, I think that the necessary precursor is to admit that these questions fall onto a landscape and admit of right and wrong answers. Thank you very much.
Our founding fathers were an elite league of wealthy aristocrats, well-educated at a time when most people never received a secondary education, if they got a first one. And the fact that so many of them had such disdain against religion caused a backlash, such that early in our history there were repeated waves of religious revivalism. And because religion likes to reverse everything, they refer to this religious revivalism as the Great Awakening. The advantage of faith over reason is that reason requires understanding, which requires education, which requires resources of time and intelligent comprehension and accurate source material vetted by scholarship. But religion needs none of that, because it's just talking out of your ass. Pretending to know things no one even can know, pretending that you'll never die. It allows the lowliest idiot to pretend that he is wiser than the wise, ignoring every indication otherwise, as if he has the direct connection to the ear of the most powerful being imaginable. Someone that could even make 2 + 2 equal the square root of -1, if that's what it takes. A desperate emotional mind will accept irrational answers, especially if one doesn't know better and doesn't want to. And that, as I see it, is very often the problem. We believe different things for different reasons. I believe what I do is a logical consequence of my understanding of the facts, and my position will obligately change according to my understanding, which hopefully will improve. And I think that evidence is the only reason anyone should ever believe anything, and that a secure confidence should be reserved for those times when evidence is both indisputable and overwhelming. Whenever there could be a doubt, there should be, and I think that's what skepticism is. Critical thinking, so as not to be fooled. As I understand it, a fool is one who too readily accepts improbable claims from questionable sources on insufficient evidence, or when one believes such claims completely without any doubt, as all of these supposedly sacred scriptures require. So it's not at all surprising that the Bible and the Quran both use the opposite definition of fool than the dictionary does. They will say that you're a fool if you don't gullibly swallow it all and believe it on faith just because they said so. And they're telling you this because they're trying to fool you, obviously. They're both questionable sources, making outrageously dubious claims without any evidence at all, and all of their power, whether it is controlling principalities, collecting tithe, and regulating and restricting everybody's personal lives, all comes from duping the masses. Deception is the source of all of their power. But if you believe whatever you're told, without question, without reservation, or certainly without reason, then by definition, you're a fool. And I believe that the human authors of these and other books pretending to speak for God knew that, and that's why they tried to reverse the definition. So what I see is a division where at the extremes, you have one group that has a deep-seated emotional need to believe, and on the other extreme, you have people that desire to understand. Those who have that desire will inquire, and those who don't won't. Which is why when somebody falls away from their religion, they're ostracized, criticized, bastardized, but nobody ever questions why. And in the relatively rare case that somebody comes from a non-religious background and adopts a religious belief, the reason they believe that is the only thing we want to know because we want to understand. And that's why it is that when you're trying to explain science to irrational believers, they're deliberately obtuse. They're intentionally trying to maintain a misunderstanding. They don't want to understand what they don't want to know, or they don't want to know what they don't want to know. They want to believe something else, and they'll find any excuse necessary to rationalize that. And if you try to press on to teach somebody who doesn't want to believe, to get them to understand a particular premise or concept, get them to acknowledge that progress and then move on to the next step, they'll stop you very early on, sometimes with the admission that they don't want to know, they just want to believe. And I don't have a choice to believe whatever I want. All I can believe is whatever is indicated. But religious extremists have admitted that they believe what they do as an act of will, of mind over matter, the power of positive thought, as if wishes might come true if you can believe hard enough. And of course, I'm not talking about everybody, but there have been people who have told me that they want to believe with all their heart. And this tells me that those people are lying to themselves. And I've even seen ministers, I know ministers, who have said defense of this under the colloquialism, fake it till you make it. Just keep lying to yourself until you believe it. As a matter of fact, as an anecdotal example, one of my best friends from high school, who is now a fundamentalist Baptist preacher, once upon a time when we were teenagers, we had a conversion experience, where I accepted Jesus, like everybody else does. And I inquired of my friend, I said, how do I know that this euphoria that I feel like I'm wandering around as a daze, the way people hypnotize themselves. I said, how do I know that this euphoria is real? And that I didn't just imagine it, or that it didn't come from some other source. And he grabbed me by both shoulders with a huge beaming smile and said, just keep telling yourself it's Jesus until you believe it. Which tells me that faith is a willfully ignorant, auto-deceptive self-delusion, and that was my last instant as a Christian. And sometimes when I pointed out some inconvenient truth that disproves their point, their response is that I'm hurting people. People that still want to believe, what I've just disproved. They continue to want to believe it even after they know it's wrong. But why would you want to believe something after you know that it's not even probably true? And they'll tell me that they're going to believe, these may be what the facts are, but I want to believe this. And that is an admission that they don't care what the truth really is. Now, this doesn't apply to everyone, of course. Some people are born into it, indoctrinated early, and never questioned it because everyone around them believes the same thing. So it must be true, right? Or I've had people tell me that they believe what they do because they want to, because they have to, because they're afraid not to. And one of my friends from about 20 years ago told me that I'm Christian because I like to believe that, not because I think it's true. And I don't think he realizes what he's admitted to me. And even in the case where they admit that on some level they know that it's not really true, I often hear that even if it's not true, we should believe it anyway. As if believing it anyway will somehow make us better people. And we know statistically that it doesn't. If you look at all the demographics for the most religious areas and the least religious areas, and you compare their crime rate and especially their murder rate and their child poverty rate, their education levels, teen pregnancy, all of these things, you see that belief in God statistically makes you a worse person. But these people believe what they want to believe simply because they want to believe it.
It's important for us to recognize that we decide what is good in the good book. We cherry-pick these books based on our own ethical intuitions. All we have to decide questions of ethics are our own ethical intuitions and the ethical intuitions of others who we are in conversation with. You can put your faith in a 21st century conversation about ethics, or you can put your faith in a first century conversation as preserved in these books. And the problem of faith really is that it is a conversation stopper. As long as you don't have to give reasons for what you believe, you have effectively immunized yourself against the power of human conversation. I mean, you hear religious people say things like, there's nothing you can say that will change my mind. I mean, just imagine that said in medicine. If there's nothing that can be said that will change your mind, if there's no evidence or argument that can be adduced, that proves that you are not taking any state of the world into account in your beliefs. The problem with this is that when the stakes are high, we have a choice between conversation and violence. At the level of society, we have a choice between conversation, negotiation, and war. The only willingness to take on and consider new evidence and new argument guarantees that this human collaboration is open-ended. Only that willingness guarantees that. Religion is the one area of discourse where we have made a fetish of a very different frame of mind. And this leads to two kinds of violence, two kinds of conflict. I mean, first we can concede that there are other sources of human conflict. There would be wars without religion. There's tribalism, there's nationalism, there's racism, ethnic rivalry. But there's no kind of us-them thinking that really makes a transcendental object of the differences between in-group and out-group. I mean, the difference between you and your neighbor is not merely skin color, it's not merely language, it's not merely politics, it's not merely that you want his belongings. It's that this difference, this means something for eternity. And so what you have are populations of people who organize their moral identities around their religious affiliation, whether or not they care so much about the theological details. And this leads to conflict when a society is stressed. Over and over again, we see societies breaking down along religious lines. This happened in Ireland, Bosnia. It's not that the Irish were fighting over the doctrine of the transubstantiation. but their identities, their core moral identities, were built around religious affiliation. Then there's the other kind of religious violence, which is explicitly theological, where you literally have people killing other people because they think the creator of the universe wants them to do it, and they think there will be a reward for doing it. And the preeminent example of this is what we see every day on the front page of the paper, that this jihadist violence. So my argument to you really, and my argument in my book, is that unless we call into question the dogma of faith, unless we call into question the idea that beliefs can be sanctified by something other than evidence and argument, we will never successfully undercut the basis for religious violence. Now, I've said many nasty things about religious faith. This is not to say that religion is merely a shell game. This is not to say that all religion is just a tissue of lies and misconceptions and cognitive errors designed to anesthetize us against our fear of death. It is that to some significant degree, but it is more than that. There is no doubt that people have spiritual experiences. I use this word spiritual and mystical in my book, and I use them in scare quotes because, frankly, there are many embarrassing associations with these terms. But there is no doubt that people have extraordinary transformative experiences and can have them deliberately. Every culture has produced people who have gone off into caves for 40 days or 40 years and discovered that a deliberate use of attention, of introspection, through meditation, through prayer, this can really transform the human mind. And the testimony we have on this subject comes to us through our religious traditions. And unfortunately, therefore, it is mingled with all manner of superstition and dogma. And it's not mingled to the same degree in every tradition. And this is also taboo, to notice that our contemplative traditions, our spiritual traditions, are not equally insightful. East and West, for instance. It's a bit of a cultural mystery as to why this is so, but the Eastern tradition has been, the Indian tradition generally, and Buddhism especially, has been so much more sophisticated, so much more empirical in their study of first-person experience, or just in their study of what it is possible for a human being to realize if he or she just pays close attention to the flow of experience. There are analogs in the Western tradition. There have been great Christian and Jewish and Muslim contemplatives. Yes, I mean, in the context of every ideology, there are people making the best of it. But the difference, East and West, in contemplative terms, really is like the difference between Western medicine and Eastern medicine. If you have an appendicitis, you better hope that you're near a Western hospital with a Western-trained surgeon. You don't want to see your acupuncturist. I mean, maybe there are some things that Eastern medicine is better for, but generally speaking, Western medicine is the only medicine we have. And incidentally, if you do get an appendicitis, you might consider this idea that you've been intelligently designed. If ever there were a reductio ad absurdum of intelligent design, it's the appendix.
Richard Dawkins, it's a great honor to have you on our program. I wanted to tell you first that your name is the most Googled name in Iran. They did a search and saw that it was actually your name that came up. And it shows just what a large following you have in Iran and in the Middle East and North Africa. I've come across countless ex-Muslims, and the first thing they often say is, I became an atheist as a result of the God delusion. Tell us a bit about that book, and I mean, it's had huge effects.
Well, I'm astonished by what you say, and delighted if that's really true about the most Googled name in Iran. I'm not even sure. Is it even translated into Persian? Is it the God Delusion?
I think actually a lot of your work and videos are translated into Persian by
Yes.
people who are fans.
Yes, so it's not an official publication. Well, I'm delighted. I mean, the more access people have to it, the better. I'm extremely pleased about that, and delighted if it's true that my books are read in Iran. So that makes me feel very good. Thank you.
I mean, for those who haven't had a chance to read The God Delusion, tell us a bit about some of the main arguments you make in that book.
Oh, it's a whole long book. I'm not sure I can possibly summarize. I mean, I suppose the central argument is that there is absolutely no scientific reason to believe in any kind of supernatural creator. I think it's an interesting scientific hypothesis that there is a supernatural creator. It is a scientific hypothesis, and it's false. And people who think that there is a good scientific reason to believe in a supernatural creator are wrong. They simply need to look at the evidence. In many cases, they simply haven't looked at the evidence. Many people, for example, are persuaded by the apparently designed nature of the living world. And you've only got to understand Darwinism to know that that's nonsense. That, I suppose, is the central argument. But then in the second half of the book, it goes into the evils that religion perpetrates. And evils on children, warfare, all sorts of things like that.
I mean, I think especially for people who live in Iran or under Islamic rule, those are quite clear, and in a sense that's why we're seeing a rise of atheism, particularly via social media. I mean, do you have contact with people from the Middle East or North Africa via social media?
Not very much, no. I mean, I would like to have more. So I don't have very much contact, no.
What about, you've got a foundation for reason and science. What are the aims of that foundation?
Well, Reason and Science sort of sums it up. And there are two foundations, one in Britain and one in America. And partly what we do is simply support other organizations. Like, for example, my British foundation supports your ex-Muslim organization. The American one does a lot of different things, but among other things, what it does is to try to help ex-Muslims in America to get together and to recognize each other's existence and to gain confidence from each other's existence.
Do you worry about the role that religion is playing now in the public space, particularly when you look at Islam and the political Islamic movement?
Yes, very much so. I think that it's an extremely pernicious thing that people believe that because they have faith in something that somehow justifies. I mean, the only justifiable reason to believe in something is evidence. There is no other reason to believe in something other than evidence, broadly understood. And as long as people in the world think that a holy book or a priest or an imam or a faith tradition is a reason to believe something, and that's a sufficient reason to believe something, then extremists among them are going to be killing for that belief, and that's exactly what we're seeing.
You have some interesting perspectives on faith schools and Islamic schools. Well, obviously in Iran all schools are Islamic, but there's the whole, the fact that they are tantamount to child abuse.
Well, I think that indoctrinating children with false beliefs is, especially if they are distressing beliefs, like a belief in hell. I think that that teaching children that they're going to burn in hell forever if they do bad things is child abuse. I think that labeling children as either Christian children, Catholic children, Protestant children, or Muslim children is child abuse. And I raise consciousness of this by saying you would never dream of talking about a monetarist child or a Hayekian child or a Marxist child or an existentialist child or a postmodernist child. Nobody ever does that. But we do talk about Muslim children and Christian children. Why? There's absolutely no justification for that. And that, I think, is a form of child abuse. Tying a label around a child's neck when the child is too young to know what it thinks.
I mean, what do you think are the best ways to lessen religion's role in the public space? I mean, particularly when it comes to the state, the law, the educational system.
Education, where education is not indoctrination, but teaching people to think for themselves, to think critically, to doubt, to question, to look for evidence. That, I think, is the the best, possibly the only way.
And as a final question, I mean, in a sense, your coming out project, where you encourage atheists to come out, particularly in places where they are facing pressure, because we've also seen how wonderful it feels when you do actually
Yes.
find that you're not on your own.
It is a great sense of liberation, and it's something that my foundation is actively involved in encouraging. It's a bit different in parts of the Islamic world where coming out can actually be dangerous, and so people need to be actually brave to come out. And I think the remedy there is to try to get enough of them to do it, because if sufficiently large critical mass come out, then the tyrannical authorities who might threaten their life will find it much harder to do.
Yes, the question is on cargo cults, which are these, which is this phenomenon after the Second World War in which some of these South Pacific Islanders had constructed faux runways and faux airport towers to get the planes to return with the cargo, which they saw, because it was real, it really happened. And so, but they, of course, had a misunderstanding of causality. but the interesting part is how this then gets repeated and replicated. And it's a nice example of watching in real time the construction of a myth or a religion, something like that. So I do talk about that. I think other interesting examples of things similar to that would be resurrection myths are pretty common, virgin birth myths are pretty common, flood myths are pretty common. And you can diffuse the claim by Christians to uniqueness by pointing out that there are plenty of these central core stories about the resurrection, the virgin birth, and so on that predate the Christian story. Even the Noachian flood story, the Old Testament story. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a flood story that predates by many centuries. So you can just kind of come at it from an anthropological perspective, which is really what kind of did me in. One of the things that did me in as a believer was actually just studying other people's beliefs from an anthropological or social psychological perspective. It really makes you realize these guys all believe just like me. And they all think they're right too. What are the chances that I got it right? Well, most people, if you push them, they'll go, well, yeah, I do think I'm the right one. But just a smattering of humility, you have to realize that these things are socially constructed. So although I can't prove there's no God, technically, I think we can make a really good case, I do in my God chapter, a really good case that religions and belief in God are completely constructed by us, by our brains, by our cultures. I think that's a reasonable argument to make against the theistic claims.
What's wrong with the Ten Commandments? Well, the answer is a lot. Most people think of the Ten Commandments as epitomizing wise law-giving. But these Bible edicts, in fact, epitomize the opposite. The childishness, the vindictiveness, the sexism, the inflexibility, and the moral inadequacies of the Bible. But before we parse these 10 decrees one by one, we want to point out that only 6 of the 10 Commandments even try to deal with what we would consider individual, human-to-human moral conduct. This comes as a surprise to most Christians. The first 4 commandments deal only with the uneasy vanity of the biblical deity and how he might zap you if you disobey. He might even zap your children and your great-great-grandchildren if you fail to stroke his uneasy vanity.
And there are actually 3 versions of the 10 Commandments in the Hebrew Bible. The only version actually labeled the 10 Commandments is Exodus 34, but it has some bizarre wording. For example, its version of the 10th Commandment says, "Thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk." This refers to goats and hardly rates being in the top 10.
Well, it's a good thing that commandment is there, because I've been sorely tempted to take a goat and boil it in its mother's milk. Haven't you ever felt like that? We need those 10 Commandments to keep us on the straight and narrow. But that's for Exodus 34, the ones that are called the 10 Commandments. For the purposes of today's show, we're going to use the one most Christians use, which is Exodus 20. They were actually not written on stone tablets in Exodus 20. They were just spoken by Moses. So conveniently, the same version in Exodus 20 was used by Cecil B. DeMille in his, you've seen the movie from the 1950s, this overwrought epic, which is called The 10 Commandments.
So let's begin with a little help from the so-called voice of God as depicted in DeMille's 1950s film, The 10 Commandments. I guess that was really good special effects in the 1950s.
Well, and then have you ever wondered, the voice of God is always this deep basso profundo, I am the Lord thy God. That's obviously meant to intimidate, like a big father figure or the alpha gorilla with this deep voice of this big, I mean, why does God have to have a voice at all? He might have been a tenor.
Or Dan, why not a soprano? Because this is clearly very patriarchal.
Very patriarchal. I mean, he could have said, I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods before. Somehow that just wouldn't work, would it?
Well, and of course, the first commandment is very bossy. It does require that deep baritone, and very antithetical to civil rights and rights of conscience, and certainly antithetical to the First Amendment of the Constitution. You have no religious liberty under the First Commandment, and everybody should feel rather indignant about that. And it also is interesting that it seems to reference that there are many other gods that you might choose, but you have to choose me.
Well, the point is that many modern Christians, like I used to be when I was a preacher, think that American law is based on the 10 Commandments. But as you just said, it is antithetical to our actual American laws, which contradict the 10 Commandments.
They give you freedom of religion. There is no freedom of religion in the Bible. So now on to the second commandment.
Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image.
And that's interesting. Here is a commandment against making a graven image that's on a graven image,
Slight
right?
contradiction.
Contradiction there.
And
But
of course, the Catholic versions of the 10 Commandments, when they post them, always take this version out.
They used to,
They don't
yeah.
talk about the graven
if you ever
images.
see 10 Commandments without that second commandment, that's the Roman Catholic version. But what's interesting is that when you keep reading that commandment, he says, don't make a graven image because, why? I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God. He uses that word jealous. And later he even says, my name is jealous. Visiting the iniquity of the fathers unto the third and fourth generations. So in this commandment, God is banning art. He's prohibiting freedom of religion. He's promising to punish innocent children and grandchildren for the crimes of the parents. I mean, we would call that immoral.
And why would, if there was a God, an omnipotent, powerful God, why would that God care if some little person on earth went putting around making a graven image? I mean, this is slightly ridiculous.
Well, the reason is that the biggest sin in the Old Testament was idolatry. And so the Canaanites and these other villages around there, they had their other gods. They had their Ashereth poles that were worshiping other gods. And so God said, I'm jealous. Don't you make any image of any other god, just only me, me, me.
And maybe the other root here is the sin of disobedience. This is all about master-slave relationship. So let's see what number 3 is.
Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain.
So I'm sorely tempted to break that commandment, Dan. I hate the third commandment. And I feel that it's, of course, people might think it has no real meaning today, but it's really the root of blasphemy laws, which have haunted society since the Bible, and were a major factor in the 19th century in the Western world, and even in the United States, although blasphemy laws have no place where we have a First Amendment. And we see today the problems around the world where there are theocracies that are based on the Hebrew version, which includes Islamist nations who share the Mosaic Law with Christianity and Judaism, where people have been and continue to be put to death, beheaded, imprisoned. We know people who are in prison, such as Ansaf Hadar's husband, Ralph Badawi, in Egypt for essentially committing blasphemy. So this is a very, very dangerous commandment.
So scholars are not in agreement about what that phrase even means, take the name in vain. But I think you're right. It has to do with insulting or challenging the authority of or blasphemy, as you say. But one of our jokes around here at FFRF is that blasphemy is a victimless crime. Since there's no God, you can blaspheme. And I actually think it's more than that. It's no crime at all. Blasphemy is not a crime. I think blasphemy is a positive moral impulse, because you have the freedom to say to your dad or to the king or to the dictator or the president or whoever is claiming to be an authority above you, we have the freedom to say, hey, you did wrong. And if you don't have that freedom, that shows that the authority is very insecure to have their power questioned.
So now on to the Sabbath.
Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy.
Yeah, so remember the Sabbath day. You should work for 6 days, and on the seventh day you should rest. On its face, that kind of looks like a kind of nice way to have a day off of work where you can take Sunday and relax and go to church and worship. Isn't that nicey-nicey? However, if you read what the Old Testament says about the Sabbath, it's a capital crime. You deserve the death penalty if you don't observe the Sabbath to make it holy. I mean, what does the word holy even mean? It means obey God. And there are many examples in the Bible where people who broke the Sabbath were actually put to death. There's a story in the book of Numbers about an Israelite man. On the Sabbath day, he was found outside the camp picking up sticks.
Undoubtedly to make a fire.
To make a fire, maybe for his family. But what a horrible crime. He was picking up sticks. The Israelites grabbed the guy, and they didn't know what to do with him. He was breaking the law. He was doing work on the Sabbath. So they took him to Moses, and they said, Moses, we found this guy doing this. What should we do? And Moses asked God, and God said, yep, he's got to die. So they took him outside the camp, and they stoned him to death. So that was a capital crime not to worship and not to keep the Sabbath day holy. But how many religious right people today who put the Ten Commandments on their property, how many of them own businesses that are open all weekend long? They're still working on it.
And Dan, you and I are old enough to well remember when everything shut down on Sundays in the United States, even into the 1960s. It's been a gradual change that you could do other things on Sunday. And in the 19th century, many devout churchgoers were told to do nothing. And even in Orthodox Judaism, something as simple as tearing off a piece of toilet paper is considered to be improper. It has to be done ahead of time.
Or turning a light switch or any of it.
And that's why they have this sort of ludicrous system of eruves to get around these very inconvenient rules. So again, this is all about the uneasy vanity of worshiping this God.
Just that one God.
So now the fifth commandment.
Honor thy father and thy mother.
Now, on its face, I think, Dan, this seems like a nice commandment. At least there's no murder involved, I hope. Although the Bible does call for killing disobedient children. So
in some places,
there's more to it than that. But my gripe with this commandment is that it's backwards. Parents bring children into the world, and we are responsible for them. We are responsible for their well-being, their very life. We should be told to honor our children. And if we honor our children, we hope someday when they grow up that we will have deserved that they will choose voluntarily to honor us, not because the fifth commandment tells them to do so.
And what is a child supposed to do with this commandment who has parents who are abusive or neglectful? Are they supposed to just honor? Really, this whole thing goes back to the ancient Israelite patriarchal perpetuity, that it's inheritance rights, it's passing on, and who you should marry. You should do what your mom and dad say so you can keep everything within the family.
All right, now let's look at the sixth commandment. So this is the biggie.
Yeah, thou shalt not kill. You know, it's as if the human race is so stupid. We never would have figured out before these commandments came down that there's something wrong with killing. Killing has existed, prohibitions against killing have existed in all cultures long before the Israelites claimed the copyright to this thing. So this is one of the 3 actual commandments in the Ten Commandments that are relevant to modern American law: killing, stealing, and perjury. So yes, but it's couched in absolute terms. That word in the Hebrew word there is ratzak, which scholars have trouble translating. Some Christians will say it meant thou shalt not murder, but actually that word ratzak is used all through the Bible for accidental killings, for manslaughter, for killings by animals. So the problem with this is that right after this commandment was given, thou shalt not kill, God then tells the Israelites to go out and kill, kill, kill. And the Bible's filled with examples of genocides and infanticides and filicides and all sorts of bloodshed and homicide. So the Bible contradicts itself when it says thou shalt not kill, but then says kill, kill, kill.
And of course, there is, in modern law, there are degrees. So there is the recognition you might accidentally kill somebody, you might run somebody over by accident, manslaughter, for example. This is all in complete absolutes. Killing in self-defense, and obviously killing in war. They kind of overlook that one.
Yeah.
So how about the next commandment?
Thou shalt not commit adultery.
So when you only have 10 top rules to follow, why would we focus on adultery? Why doesn't the Ten Commandments say, thou shalt not hurt people, thou shalt not commit sexual assault, thou shalt not commit child abuse? I think that...
Or thou priest shall not rape children.
So Dan, you and I are married, and I would just assume you followed this commandment
Well,
because
I would
you
assume
want
you
to,
would too.
But there can be no law that should legislate that. That's between individual parties. It may be a good thing, it may be something to encourage, but we can't interfere in marriages where that have outlived love or there's some other arrangement. This should not be a law. And of course, it used to be a law, and people could be put to death for committing adultery or could be used against them. And this is not appropriate in a secular society. But certainly, it does not rate the top 10.
The reason it's in the Ten Commandments is because they are patriarchal commandments, and a wife was property. So thou shalt not commit adultery was saying, keep your hands off another man's property. Don't touch her. You have your own wife. This property belongs to someone else. It is not directed at females. It's a patriarchal perpetuity that's happening here.
So speaking of property, let's look at the next commandment.
Thou shalt not steal.
And of course, that's another one of the 3 that does have relevance to modern American law, prohibition against stealing, although it is couched in absolute terms like the other ones. And of course, the Israelites themselves went in and they stole and they raped and they took over and they invaded. The promised land was basically stolen. So the commandments contradict themselves.
And also, there should be degrees again. If some child is starving to death, would we say that stealing is wrong? Do we want to go back to the Dickensian times when children and people starving to death could be put to death for stealing an apple or a bun from a store?
Or their hands were cut off.
Again, we want to have some leniency for circumstances. Let's look at the next commandment.
Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor.
So that basically means lying. It's interpreted to be lying. And in the United States, of course, there is no general law against telling a lie, but there are laws about perjury in court and in false advertising and such, and in contractual agreements. But notice that it says against thy neighbor. And the phrase thy neighbor in the Old Testament referred to your Hebrew neighbor. It didn't apply to anyone else. And when Jesus quoted the Old Testament that said you should love your neighbor as yourself, that verse meant your Hebrew kin, your Hebrew neighbor. It did not apply to anyone outside of your tribe.
And of course, you can't really legislate against lying. There are many circumstances where it would be a crime to lie to police, to the FBI, but people tell white lies every day to save feelings. So this is really kind of a way overbroad commandment.
And once in a while, a lie is the right thing to do if you're protecting somebody from harm.
So let's look at that final commandment.
Thou shalt not covet anything that is thy neighbor.
And it goes on to talk about thy neighbor's house and thy neighbor's wife, thy neighbor's slaves, or their ass, or anything.
So let me interrupt. Wait a minute. We have women, wives put in with the livestock. This is such an insult. It's so sexist.
Well, that's that whole pattern of patriarchy within the Ten Commandments. Adultery and coveting, you know, whatever your neighbor owns. There is that old joke that if we were to follow the 10th commandment against coveting, our whole system of free enterprise would collapse. Coveting is not a crime. It's actual harm that are the crimes.
So I think that we have demolished the Ten Commandments, but when we come back from this break, we're going to look at why the Ten Commandments should not be part and are not part of our civil law in the United States.
Some religions, like all other major human creations, have experienced an unsettling amount of power, struggles, and of course, a whole lot of questionable decisions made by people who really should have known better. Thomas Aquinas. The church in particular has had its fair share of moments where it definitely did not act like it was run by a fan club of an all-loving and all-caring deity, man. So, today, let's take a stroll down the memory lane and unpack 5 of the church's greatest hits, and by hits, I mean what the moments, that will highlight just how far the God delusion has evolved to today. Number 1, the persecution of William Tyndale. Now, I'm not a believer, but William Tyndale is easily one of my favorite historical characters, man. His dedication alone was something, man. Yo. Anyway, for those of you who haven't heard of the legend yet, William Tyndale was the OG Bible translator who just wanted to make the good book accessible for the common folk like you and I. He is easily one of the major reasons that the Bible is available in so many languages today. So let's go ahead and look at his story. So back in the 16th century, the Catholic Church was like, you know what? Only we get to interpret the Bible, and we've decided that we'll keep it in languages that only aristocrats will understand. We don't want the peasants getting any funny ideas. Do we now? However, Tyndale, being the rebellious linguist he was, went ahead and translated the New Testament into English, which would soon prove to be a big mistake, man, because the church, needless to say, was not amused. They hunted him down like he was some loose man-eating lion, and in 1536, they captured and strangled him to death, and then burnt his body at the stake. For good measure, you know. I guess to the church nothing screams love thy neighbor like silencing someone who wanted people to read the Bible in their own languages. So yeah, Tyndale's crime was caring too much for the common folk. Number 2, the Crusades, also known as the Holy Wars / Holy Mess. If the Catholic Church had a resume, the Crusades would be under the work experience section right next to professional hypocrisy. Starting in the 11th century, the church decided it was a great idea to, reclaim the Holy Land in the Middle East from the Muslims who had conquered the land. What followed, as most of you already know, was centuries of bloodshed, pillaging, and general chaos. The church even at one point promised salvation to anyone who joined the cause, which is basically the medieval version of a pyramid scheme, and because these people were getting nothing other than losing their lives, man. And these crusades were quite popular, man, because knights, peasants, and even children, children's crusades was a thing, man. Look it up. I was surprised as well. Anyway, all these treasured members of society marched to war only to die in droves, and the church's message after all that, God willed it. The reality, however, is that a lot of people died for a piece of real estate that is still disputed to this day. Yeah, they had nothing to do with spreading love, man. If anything, they were all about spreading bodies. Not exactly a shining example of divine benevolence, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, number 3, the Galileo affair, when science met the church's wrath. So, Galilei, man, he really had one of the coolest names in history, man. Yeah, that's my opinion at least. Anyway, he was the father of modern astronomy, and at one point in his life had the audacity to suggest that the earth revolved around the sun. Genius, right? Well, the church thought otherwise because in the 17th century they put Galileo on trial for heresy because his scientific discoveries contradicted the interpretation of the Bible. The church was basically like, the sun revolves around the earth because we say so, and if you disagree, we'll make your life a living hell. And they actually could. So Galileo was forced to recant his findings and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. So I guess what we've learned is that the church's stance was basically, we're right, science is wrong, and if you disagree, just come outside. We won't jump you, we promise. Man, it is a perfect example of how the church prioritizes dogma over truth, even when the truth will or is staring them in the face, or in this case, through a telescope. So number 4, the Salem witch trials. Okay, so the Salem witch trials weren't technically orchestrated by the Catholic Church, but they were definitely fueled by religious hysteria. There is no denying that, man. In the late 17th century, Puritan leaders in colonial Massachusetts got it into their heads that witches were running amok in their community. What followed was a frenzy of accusations, trials, and executions, where people were accused of witchcraft for things like having a bad temper, owning a black cat, or just being generally unpopular in the community. And what was the church's role in all this, man? Well, nothing much, just fanning the flames of fear and superstition. And the result was that 20 people were executed in the community, and the town of Salem became a cautionary tale of how or what happens when religion and paranoia collide. The church's defense was basically that it was protecting the people from evil, but in retrospect, I think we can all see who were the real agents of evil, man. Number 5, the selling of indulgences when forgiveness came with a price tag in the Catholic community. Picture this, it's the Middle Ages and the church has a brilliant idea. Why not sell forgiveness for sins? And thus arose indulgences, which are the spiritual equivalences of a get out of hell free card of some sort. The church claimed that by purchasing these indulgences, you could reduce your time in purgatory or even skip it altogether. Basically, think of it as a celestial timeshare instead of a beachfront property. You're buying your way into heaven. Cute, man. That sounds like an idea I'd subscribe to if I was a believer. The only problem in this case was the practice was ripe with corruption. Wealthy folks in the community arrested under the orders of the church could buy their way out of jails, while the poor were left to suffer. And the church, just like today, became less about spiritual guidance and more about filling its coffers. Luckily for us, this practice eventually sparked outrage and played a significant role in the Protestant Reformation. So, I guess nothing says holy like exploiting people's fear of eternal damnation for profit. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, 5 examples of the church being, well, not so holy. Thank you guys for joining me for today's rundown. I really hope you've enjoyed the content as much as I have. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Peace, man.